Before this story begins, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because stories like this aren't just watched, they're felt. The silence of the house usually felt like a physical weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over the furniture and the hardwood floors the moment the sun went down, reminding Emily that she was the only living soul breathing within these walls. For 3 years, ever since the last of her children had packed their lives into cardboard boxes and driven away to start their own futures, she had learned to live with the echoes of a life that used to be loud. But tonight, the silence was different, charged with a frantic, electric energy that made the air feel thin and dangerously fragile. It wasn't the emptiness that kept her awake this time. It was the presence of someone else, a secret she had kept buried under layers of maternal guilt and fear for months. Michael was sitting on the edge of the plush armchair in the living room, his hands clasped together, his eyes watching her with a patience she didn't feel she deserved. They had been talking in hushed tones, sipping red wine, pretending that they were just two adults enjoying an evening, but the looming shadow of her son's judgment hung over Emily like a storm cloud waiting to break. Then it happened, the sound that shattered the fragile atmosphere they had built. A knock, not a polite midday rap on the wood, but a heavy, insistent pounding that echoed through the hallway like a thunderclap at midnight. Emily froze, her heart colliding against her ribs with such violence she feared it might be audible in the terrified stillness. She looked at Michael, her eyes wide with a panic that belonged to a teenager caught breaking curfew, not a woman in her 50s. Michael stood up, his instinct to move toward the door, to protect. But she held up a trembling hand, stopping him in his tracks. "No," she whispered, the word barely escaping her throat. "Stay here. Please. Just stay out of sight." She didn't wait for his nod. She rushed toward the hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the cold hardwood, her mind racing through a catalog of disasters. Who knocks at midnight? Police? A neighbor with bad news? Or worse? Her hand hovered over the brass knob, her breath held tight in her chest, compressing her lungs until they burned. She pulled the door open, bracing herself for a stranger, for tragedy. But it wasn't a stranger. It was Daniel. Her son stood on the porch, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a weariness that seemed to pull him down toward the earth. Looked older than she remembered, the porch light casting long, hollow shadows across his face, highlighting lines of stress she hadn't noticed during their last video call. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking, a sound so full of vulnerability it nearly broke her. "I didn't know where else to go." All the fear of the last minute evaporated, replaced instantly by the fierce, protective instinct of a mother. She didn't ask questions. She simply reached out and pulled him into the warmth of the foyer, wrapping her arms around his damp coat, smelling the rain and the scent of exhaustion clinging to him. "It's okay," she murmured into his shoulder, rocking him slightly as she had when he was a boy. "You're here. You're safe." But as they pulled apart and Daniel stepped further into the house, the atmosphere shifted again. The air in the hallway was thick, carrying the unmistakable scent of a second glass of wine, a hint of cedar and men's cologne that wasn't hers. Daniel stiffened. He looked down the hallway toward the living room, where the golden glow of the lamp spilled out onto the floor. He turned back to her, confusion knitting his brows together. "Mom?" he asked, his voice lower now, laced with a new tension. "Is someone here?" Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, to invent a lie, to claim it was the television or the radio, but the words turned to ash on her tongue. It was too late. From the living room came the undeniable scrape of a shoe against the floorboards, followed by the clearing of a throat. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his posture shifting from exhaustion to defense. He stepped past her, moving toward the living room with a purposeful stride that terrified her. "Daniel, wait," she pleaded, reaching for his arm, but he was already at the threshold. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, waiting. For the explosion, for the accusations of betrayal, for the anger she felt sure was coming. She followed him, her legs feeling heavy and useless. When she entered the room, the scene before her wasn't one of chaos, but of paralyzed stillness. Michael was standing by the fireplace, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace, looking calm but wary. Daniel stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the man who had been sharing his mother's silence. The seconds stretched out, agonizing and long, the silence ringing in Emily's ears. Then Daniel let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. His shoulders dropped. The defensive aggression melted away, replaced by a look of realization. He looked from Michael to Emily, seeing not a secret to be ashamed of, but a loneliness that had finally been answered. Daniel started, his voice rough. He looked at Michael again. I didn't want to wake you, Mom. I didn't want to be alone tonight. He paused, a sad smile touching his lips as he looked at Michael. I guess you didn't either. The tension in the room snapped, replaced by a wave of relief so potent it made Emily's knees weak. She watched as Michael stepped forward, extending a hand not as an intruder, but as a support. Daniel took it. In that handshake, in the quiet acceptance of the midnight hour, Emily realized that the fear of judgment had been her own creation. Her son knocked at midnight seeking refuge, and instead of finding a lonely woman waiting in the dark, he found a home that was finally alive again. The silence returned, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was full of hope, fragile, wrapping around the three of them like a promise kept.